Africa has tried stricter laws, new anti-corruption agencies, new administrations, new promises of a fundamentally different kind of leadership. And yet, corruption persists, not occasionally, not in isolated pockets, systematically, generationally, stubbornly resistant to almost every intervention directed at it. And the question that really receives an honest answer is this: why? What if corruption in Africa is not primarily caused by greed? What if millions of people are responding exactly the way traumatized human beings predictably respond under chronic instability? And if that is true, then perhaps almost everything we have tried to solve corruption has been targeting the symptom, not the cause. I want to suggest to you today that almost every serious attempt to answer this question has been looking in the wrong place. The answer is not only in institutions, it is not only in law, it is not even primarily in the character of leaders. The deeper answer lies in human psychology, in the emotional environment that institutions, laws, and leaders both reflect and reproduce. Corruption in Africa is not simply a political problem. It is a psychological problem. And until we understand it that way, we will continue fighting the symptoms while the deeper disease quietly survives, reproduces itself, and passes from one generation to the next. When most people discuss corruption in Nigeria or across many African nations, they immediately think about dishonest politicians, compromised officials, and broken institutions. Very few people stop to ask a deeper question: what kind of emotional environment produces corrupt behavior in the first place? Honestly, this is the question that matters most. And if we cannot answer it honestly and precisely, every anti-corruption campaign, every legislative reform, and every new administration will eventually arrive at the same destination, and that is disappointment. Today, I want to propose a different kind of framework, one rooted not only in politics, but in psychology, not only in leadership, but in lived emotional experience of ordinary people trying to survive inside deeply unstable system. Because once we begin to understand corruption as a psychological pattern and not simply a moral failure, we become far better equipped to address it in ways that produce lasting change instead of temporal reactions. Let us begin by defining trauma in a way that directly relates to the African experience. Trauma is not only about violence. It is not only about war. Trauma is what happens when people live too long under fear, instability, uncertainty, helplessness, and institutional unpredictability, especially across generations. And we cannot have an honest conversation about psychological condition of contemporary Africa without acknowledging one of its deepest historical origins: colonialism. For over a century, African societies were systematically dispossessed of land, of language, of governance structures, and in many cases, of dignity itself. Colonial systems did not simply extract resources from Africa. They extracted something even more consequential: trust. Entire populations were taught through violence, through law, and through institutional practice that Authority exists to exploit, not to serve. That institutions exist to control, not to protect. That the relationship between citizens and the state is one of extraction, not partnership. And that lesson did not disappear at independence. It was inherited. It entered the cultural bloodstream. And to this day, it still shapes how many Africans relate to government institutions, authority, and even one another. I illustrate this with a simple story. Imagine a father, a man who spent 20 years working honestly, only to watch dishonest people advance while his integrity went unrewarded. Over time, something changes in him. Not because he was born cynical, but because experience trained him to become cynical. He does not directly teach his son corruption. He teaches him through behavior, through exhaustion, through bitterness, through the way his face changes whenever government is discussed, through the quiet ways he navigates around rules that never protected him. That son grows up, he becomes educated, he enters a position of authority, and when opportunity comes, he takes what he can. Not necessarily because he is fundamentally wicked, because the first institution he ever belonged to, his family, taught him that survival requires a different kind of mathematics. This is not simply a story about greed. This is a story about inheritance. And until we understand corruption as inherited fear, inherited distrust, and inherited survival behavior, we will continue misdiagnosing the problem and therefore misapplying the solution. Another major driver of corruption operates beneath conscious awareness: psychological scarcity. Not simply lack of money, but the constant fear that there will never be enough. Enough opportunity, enough security, enough stability, enough protection. And when scarcity dominates the mind, ethical reasoning becomes secondary. The question changes from what is right to what is available, and how long will it take to remain available. This is why corruption often intensifies during economic instability. Because when the future feels uncertain, integrity can begin to feel less like a virtue and more like a loss only secure people can afford. Let me pause briefly here. If this conversation is challenging your assumptions, if it is helping you think about corruption in a deeper psychological and cultural way, I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Transformative Wisdom Channel. And please share this discussion with someone willing to engage seriously with these questions, because conversations like this are part of how healing begins. I would also genuinely love to hear from your perspective in the comment section below. Let us continue right now. Trauma does not remain confined to one generation. It travels from parent to child, from teacher to student, from leader to citizen. The research on epigenetics suggests that chronic stress can leave measurable biological traces that affect how future generations respond to fear, uncertainty, and scarcity. Beyond biology, inherited beliefs are equally powerful. A child who grows up watching rules, is treated as obstacle instead of agreements. Institutions treated as threat instead of protection, and trust treated as weakness instead of strength. Absorb those lessons deeply. Beliefs such as rules exist to be navigated, authority exists to be appeased, family loyalty matters more than collective fairness, personal survival matters more than public responsibility. And when those children become adults, entering business, politics, education, government, and leadership, they carry those inherited beliefs into every institution they touch. This is how trauma becomes culture. And this is how corruption reproduces itself across generations, even without conscious intention. Many governments in Africa have responded to corruption primarily through punishment, stricter laws, anti-corruption agencies, public prosecutions, and to be fair enough, legal accountability matters. Of course, it is necessary, but punishment alone cannot heal trauma. You cannot legislate trust into existence. You cannot arrest fear out of a traumatized population, and you cannot prosecute a survival mindset into transformation. You know why? Corruption at its deepest level is not merely legal. It is psychological. It is emotional. And intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge something uncomfortable, such as I'm speaking. Not every corrupt act emerges out of equal freedom of choice. Imagine a nurse earning almost nothing monthly, working in an unresourced hospital, responsible for overwhelming numbers of patients, with no reliable institutional support. If she accepts informal payment from desperate family, is that purely moral failure? Or is it survival behavior inside a structurally broken system? Real change requires both personal responsibility and structural reform simultaneously. Without functioning system, integrity becomes extremely difficult to sustain. And without personal integrity, even strong institutions eventually decay. We need both. Anything less is incomplete. So how does healing begin? Not with slogans, not with endless condemnation, not with waiting for perfect leaders. Healing must happen at three fundamental, interconnected levels simultaneously. Talking about institutional, community level, individual level. At the institutional level, healing begins when people consistently observe fairness, when rules apply equally, when competence is rewarded, when reporting wrongdoing does not punish the whistleblower. That consistency is how trust slowly returns. At the community level, healing begins when families and schools stop normalizing inherited dysfunction, when children are taught that inherited patterns are not destiny, when communities develop the courage to examine the beliefs they have unconsciously carried for generations. At the individual level, healing begins with deliberate integrity, especially when integrity is costly, because every repeated act of integrity slowly reconstructs the internal narratives from the system cannot be trusted to I am willing to become part of building a different kind of system. These are not as abstract ideas. They are daily practices, and they are available to every person listening today. Let me close with a personal question. What pattern are you carrying that you did not consciously choose? What belief about scarcity, about distrust, about fairness, about survival did you inherit rather than intentionally develop? Because the moment you can clearly name an inherited belief, you have already begun weakening its control over your life. And that matters deeply. Real transformation does not begin with political speeches. It does not begin with waiting for perfect leaders. It begins here, in the human mind, in our daily choices, in small acts of integrity no law can force and no government can monitor. The transformation of Africa will not begin in government buildings. It will begin in the human mind. And when the mind begins to heal, when trust slowly returns, when survival thinking gives way to something healthier and more expansive, the system itself will begin to change, because the system is not separate from us. The system is us. And when enough minds change, history changes with them. Thank you for your listening attention. Please remember to subscribe to this channel. Just press the subscribe and bell button. And most importantly, share your thoughts on the comment section. Like and share the video. Until I come your way again, together we can make a difference in Africa.